Number two, he has a family practice. I never got quite sure if somebody likes general medicine or primary care, but he just moved to the building that's right across the street here. He was across from O'Fallon High School in the memorial building there, and just in the last month, there's a group. You can kind of explain how many physicians are in your group over there, but they are right across the road. And then the Diabetes Education Center is out at the Memorial Belleville campus where the educators are. But so, Dr. Shaw, thank you so much for being here this evening, and I'll step out of the way.
Yeah, thank you for a nice introduction. So how's everybody doing today?
Great.
Great, good. Yeah, Tuesday evening. I don't know how difficult that was, but I'm glad everybody's here. And I hope I have something to offer for the time that you committed for this lecture. As Cheryl mentioned, my last name is Shaw and first name is Neeraj. I'm a family physician, and I had developed over the last 4 years, I've been practicing, I have developed a special interest in two aspects of medicine. One is obesity medicine or weight loss related. Every time I take care of diabetic patients, I have to go through education on nutrition as well as weight loss, and so they both are very closely related to in terms of endocrine system, and they could be cause and effect of each other. So that's essentially. So I would like to just to clear my qualification that I'm not endocrinologist or I'm not a diabetic expert, but my goal is to deliver a lecture on diabetes as a family practitioner, and in fact, in our country. Most of the time diabetes is managed by family physicians, so we have to know what diabetes and how to manage, and so essentially that's my this presentation is primarily made somewhere between a patient and a physician. So there are a lot of informations that the often patient don't have access, but I would like to lay it out, and it's not as very difficult. It's not made for physicians. It's made for patients only. What I truly believe that every patient needs to know about diabetes even more than their doctor. Doctor needs to know they have at least 100 different diseases to take care of. But every patient has to be expert on diabetes, and then only you would be able to manage that. So I don't hesitate giving as much of education possible. Sometimes some people think that more education will confuse the patients, but I truly believe that education really helps people to take care of their diabetes a little more. So the only other qualifications, obviously I have a fellowship in obesity medicine. That's where I use my knowledge of the fellowship into a weight loss clinic and try to facilitate with various ideas that I'll learn from the conferences through my fellowship. And then I'm also a certified yoga teacher, which I don't really practice that heavily. I don't teach that heavily. I do practice in a personal space. So somebody, you might be quite confused about what is this? Is it a diabetic lecture or something else? And the reason I had this title is because we really like every name has some meaning to it. And over the last 10 years in this medicine, I really didn't find much of meaning to the word diabetes. But in essence, this is what is going on in diabetes. Diabetes is one of the consequences of insulin resistance that's happening in a human physiological system, and so this is what emphasis we need to be put on. Often with diabetes and sugars, and we kind of lose the understanding of what really diabetes is. So that's why I wanted to get this name more familiar. In academics, among physicians, this is very common. We all know what this is. But patients as not quite familiar with this term. So I just wanted to give out that term out. This is ideal plate should look like. A representation of idea in this plate is whole food. That's the idea. And there is nothing processed. Yes, there are certain components in this plate that you have to cook a little bit to soften up to better. But the idea is that your plate should be filled with whole food instead of processed and various other things that we eat. And later on, we'll establish that diabetes is often disease of processed food more than anything else. All right, we'll move on to the second slide, a third slide. So there are more pictures. I know it's kind of feel a little tortured that every diabetic patient goes through and physicians tells them to eat less, but I'm putting out more and more picture of foods on my plate, so it's kind of a little torture. But these are the food that if you were told that you can't eat as a diabetic, I tend to take an objections. This is the kind of food that you should be eating. The key thing is this all are whole food. They're not processed. They're not overcooked. They're not anything that diabetics should be afraid of. Okay, so this is another ideal plate. Nobody eats like that, but this kind of gives you an idea what your plate should look like. The other idea of here, so one common thing's always been attacked is the sweet. So diabetics cannot eat sugar, and this is, I consider a myth. I don't think that as long as this sugar is coming from a whole food, real food, then it's okay. But the other aspect of this is not just pertaining to diabetes, to anybody. There are 6 fundamental tastes that our tongue is accustomed to. And then there are various diversity of the taste, mix of it, various, you can make as many different kinds of flavors to it. But these are the 6 fundamental tastes. And what happens is that if you deprive yourself with this taste because you were told to as a diabetic, you're really creating some sort of imbalance in your physiological system. And you create, not only, you try to suppress and eliminate desire of this one aspect of your taste, eventually you wouldn't be able to resist craving of those kind of foods, and you're really going to break those vows that you took with your diabetic educators or physicians. So you should have all 6 different kinds of taste in your daily meal. This is very, very important. Is everybody familiar with these 2 terms? A pungent and stringent aspect of it. Okay. All right. So let me just define, just give it a little bit of explanation of with this term. What does really insulin resistance syndrome means? Now, syndrome sounds like very a big word. Oh my gosh, I have a syndrome. But don't take it in that way. Syndrome essentially means is that it caused by multiple organs or multiple source of the disease in your body, and it damages the multiple organs with wide variety of symptoms. So that's essentially syndrome means. It doesn't mean it's not anything complex or anything to be worried about. Now, this first line is very important. High sugar that you have, that you check all the time, 90% of your time goes into, if you're uncontrolled diabetics, most of your time goes into just checking sugar. And then the other time, you're just worrying about the sugar just you checked. So that is, so one thing you need to understand that high sugar is the symptom, it's not the disease. What does that mean? It means that some infection, some underlying infection is going on. And what goes out. Every time body's trying to fight the infection, it raises the temperature. along, does that really treat the infection? It doesn't. And that's what exactly sugar is. Sugar is just the symptom of the disease. You can treat the sugar, control the sugar all day, not addressing the problem. So that point is very, very important to understand. Sugar is just the symptom of the significant underlying disease. So that's something, very important things to need to understand. Now, insulin resistance means something, insulin resistance is somehow in your body and in various systems, body develops resistance to insulin. So essentially, insulin is not as effective, okay? And how does that happen? We'll go into detail a little bit why somebody develops insulin resistance. So this disease has nothing to do with the sugar. It has all to do with the developing resistance in your body, okay? So that's what this disease is. So that's why I call it as an insulin resistance syndrome. And one of the major symptoms is high sugar, which is the only thing often addressed, nothing else. So when insulin becomes ineffective, then the body produces more insulin to do the same work. And so if you are diabetic and if you have insulin resistance, if you check your insulin, that is often very, very high. And that is a correct way of measuring rather how bad your diabetes is. Okay? So that's the kind of terminologies. Now, type 1 diabetes, if somebody's here who has a type 1 diabetes, this lecture is still relevant for them. Although the type 1 has a complete depletion of insulin, there is no insulin resistance. But over time, they can also develop insulin resistance. That means that they will require more insulin to take care of their diabetes. So the type 1 can turn into type 2 over lifetime. And then type 2 can turn into a type 1. Means that if you're type 2 for so long, nothing else works. Only insulin works. So that then becomes type 1. So you're totally depleting entire insulin resource from your pancreas. Then it becomes type 1 after a long term of diabetics. So both can reverse each other. So that's the difference between type 2 and type 1. And then the other ideas there that we already talked about. So that's essentially what we have that we are talking about today. Insulin resistance. Okay, some more pictures. So why insulin resistance? That's the question. Why am I the one chosen for this insulin resistance? What I have done wrong, or what's wrong going on in my body that I'm developing insulin resistance? So one of the most common things that earlier I mentioned, why weight loss clinic and diabetic are very closely related. Almost every diabetic that I've worked with, I wouldn't say every diabetic, but I would say 8 out of 10 diabetics that I work with, when I work on their excessive abdominal weight, their diabetes gets better. You know, and there is just no surprise to that. Whoever experienced that in their life, they will know it. And I see that every single day. Whoever loses weight, especially in the abdominal area, they will have their diabetes get better. Okay? So that is the first target. That it is a difficult goal to achieve, but that is one of the cause. How does it obesity causes or abdominal weight causes diabetes is not mystery anymore. There are a biochemistry or biochemical pathways and physiological pathways is already been established in science that how the adipose tissues is just a fancy name for subcutaneous fat or visceral fat. When is excess storage of adipose tissues, they get malfunction and they secrete a lot of toxins in your bodies and they causes insulin resistance. Now this has been established in a science quite systematically and quite robust mechanisms already been established. So there is no mystery to that. Inactivity. So obviously if you are, if in anything in life, if you are being inactive to that, you become, your sensitivity gets reduced. Means that your performance, like anything in life that we do, if you stop doing it or doing less of it, our effectiveness goes down. So that's essentially, when you do activity, obviously exercise, what I mean by a planned activity, that's exercise, or any other activities that when you do, you're constantly sensitizing all your cells, because when you do activity, every cell needs a sugar to function. Okay, so if you constantly sensitize a cell, you are reducing the resistance. So that's how activity helps to reduce reduce the resistance of insulin resistance. Processed food, that's another hot topic. Essentially, I don't have exact numbers, but very large percentage of our daily calories come from processed food. Now, processed foods are frozen food, canned food, almost 90% of fast foods, and then you have a refined or processed grains and sugars and things like that. Those are the processed food. Now, how many? All these processed foods, one way of looking at processed food is that the type of food that we used to eat 50 years ago and what we're eating now, that's the difference between processed food versus what we used to eat in the past. There was some processed food early on, but far less consumption of those food. So in processing industries, they use, depending on what specific type of food that we are processing, in processing industries, we do use a lot of growth hormones, antibiotics. We also use various chemicals, preservatives, to increase the shelf life of the food. And those chemicals are essentially can create immense amount of insulin resistance in your body. So very important, one of the most important thing as a diabetics, if you can minimize almost zero processed food in your life, your diabetes magically will get better. And I have seen that in my patients all the time. Even if you don't lose weight, just to change it from processed to whole food, your diabetes gets dramatically better. So there is no secret to that. Now, we talked about excess bad fat. Now, we're talking about adipose tissues or the fat storage. By just eating the excess trans and saturated fats, those fats tends to accumulate in the cells in various organs where they should not be. And they also create, so the excess bad fat in our body are one of the principal reasons of developing insulin resistance in our body. Okay, so those are the common reasons. Obviously, this is the most common things that I hear, that I inherited genes and my parents were diabetics, but I usually not so much in acceptance to that. I usually tell patients you inherit recipes more than genes. And the recipes of lifestyles. And that's where the problem is. It's like somebody says, I got the lung cancer because my father had lung cancer, but both smoked. So the common denominator is tobacco, not just inherited genes. Okay, so that's another. Now, even though, let's say, for all fairness, let's say you inherited bad genes and you got diabetes. Okay, you can still work on these top four things. You have no excuse to not to work on the top four things. The other things that we have developed a lot of information on genes is that just because you inherited genes does not mean that those genes going to express the disease in your body. The genes are like a switch, turning on and off. So your bad lifestyle can turn on those genes. And good lifestyle turn off those genes. How many times we see people, they have very bad family history, but they don't have that disease. We see it all the time. And vice versa. We see more of those without almost all diabetic. I would say at least 95% of diabetics that I see in the clinic, they are overweight. And that's not to offend anybody, but that's the reality of what I see every day in and out. And also, there are a lot of other common denominators on those diabetics. Many of them eating highly processed food, which is not only diabetics, even non-diabetics are also doing. It's just average American diet that we eat. All of us tends to fall into a processed food and the other aspects of the food. Okay, so I don't want to. If this is the reality, number 5, you can't change. You can't do anything about it. You don't need to worry about it. Let's worry about top 4 that we can actually make a difference. That's how I look at it. Diabetes.